my name is Mackie Haynes, and last week I focused on the muted group theory, and it really got me thinking, so I've decided that this week I will discuss a theory that ties in very well with the muted group theory, and that theory is the Communication Accommodation Theory. In short, Howard Giles claimed that when two people from different ethnic or cultural groups interact, that they tend to accommodate each other in ways that they speak in order to gain the other's approval. He chose to focus on nonverbal adjustments. The theory seeks to prove when, how, and why we change our communication styles. So which of the 8 traditions of communication theory does it belong to? This theory fits in quite well with the socio-psychological tradition of communication theory. The socio-psychological tradition embodies the scientific or the objective perspective. Scholars or theorists in this tradition believe that there are certain truths within communication that can be discovered through attentive examination and observation. Now, in applying this tradition, you're supposed to look for cause and effect relationships that will in turn help you predict the results for when people actually communicate. This way, you're able to find links, which will help you be able to answer the important question, which is how can I get others to change, or in this case, how are others changing? Okay, now that we have a brief understanding of the communication accommodation theory, and we know which of the 8 traditions of communication theory it belongs to, let's dive deeper into this very important communication theory. Early on in this theory, the research surrounding it heavily focused on communication between 2 bilingual groups in the same country. However, as years have gone on and research has gone on, this theory can apply to a number of groups and situations. Now, a very important aspect of Giles' theory is the idea of divergence or convergence. Both of these are the 2 main forms of communication accommodation, because you're either moving towards or away from others through the use of communication. So let's first discuss convergence. Convergence is when you change your communication style in order to become more similar to whoever you're talking to. Convergence can help you fit in. An example of convergence when communicating with someone of a different generation would be whenever I talk to my grandma. I have always been a very fast-paced talker, if you haven't picked up on that yet. However, when I'm communicating with my grandma, I make the conscious decision to slow down my speech and emphasize my words, so that she's able to read my lips easier if she's having a hard time hearing me. Now, this example doesn't show every aspect of convergence. There's tons of ways that you can converge with your communication. You can also practice convergence through mimicking the way others craft their sentences or through picking what topics to discuss. You see, when I got to college, I was determined to find my group and find my people, and I found myself going out of my way to bring up topics that I knew my friend group would agree with me on. I found myself quoting the same comedian, saying words I have never said in my life, and changing the way I communicated. I wanted them to see that we belonged in the same group. So you can easily assume that divergence is the opposite of convergence. It's communicating in a way to point out the differences. Divergence can allow you to stand out or to ostracize yourself. An example of this is I tend to practice divergence when we visit my relatives who are very country and very conservative. I find myself attempting to sound much more educated, dialing down what southern drawl I might have, and communicating in a way that points out our differences. I might refrain from saying y'all as much as I usually do, and I will definitely not shy away from conversations that point out our differences and make sure that they know we do not belong in the same group. The last main form of divergence that I'm going to discuss is over-accommodating, and an example of this is when people of younger generations treat elderly kind of like babies, always checking in, talking dramatically slow or loud, re-explaining things, or oversimplifying conversations. But why does communication accommodation exist in the first place? Good question. Convergence is a bit easier to explain. You see, we all want to belong, whether or not we admit it. The desire for approval is the main motivation for convergence. But what's the point of divergence? Why would we single ourselves out or point out differences with those we're communicating with? In order to adequately explain this, we have to bring in another theory, which is the social identity theory. And it was created by Henry Todgell and John Turner, and it states that we often communicate not as individuals, but as representatives of groups that we believe define us. You see, no one is merely an individual. We all have connections and ties that make us who we really are. So if one of the groups I identify with comes up in conversation, I am more likely to diverge from those I'm communicating with in order to converge with the group I believe I belong to. Giles and his colleagues still believe that listeners regard convergence as positive and divergence as negative. Now, at the beginning of this video, I pointed out that I believe the muted group theory heavily correlates to the communication accommodation theory. You see, I find myself accommodating my communication when speaking with males all the time. I use convergence to fit in, to prove I'm like one of the guys. I try to mimic the way they communicate and speak in order not to stick out. However, I also find myself using divergence and communicating in a way that points out our differences. When I'm in a group of all males and I know I'm right, I find myself apologizing, saying things like, "I'm sorry y'all, but the numbers just don't add up." Or when I get to my boss's office, I hear myself say, "Hey, I'm sorry to bother you, I was just wondering." You see, this is a learned divergence. A divergence that I picked up from other women, a divergence that was created by males, a divergence that points out the fact that I'm smaller or less than. I think this is incredibly interesting and I would love to study it more in depth. Now, like I've said before, there is no perfect theory and it is very important to view communication theories with a critical eye. The first theory critique is that it's too complex. For example, trying to adequately explain this theory in just 7 minutes was not an easy task. Even the definition of accommodation within the theory is pretty messy, and the word is the backbone of the theory. Some people argue that in this theory, the word accommodation actually means convergence, and then at other times that it means any form of altering your communication, so that can be a bit confusing. Another major issue that this theory runs into is the ability to test it and prove it right or wrong. You see, the theory is so complex that it's hard to understand the main point or main idea that the theory is going to test, which results in theorists having to create these mini-theories to fit inside the large one in order to prove their points. Lastly, gathering solid research for this theory has proven to be pretty complicated. Researchers have used both qualitative and quantitative data, which is awesome, but it's kind of a bit shocking when you consider that this theory falls under the socio-psychological tradition. Theorists also run into the issue of figuring out what the behavior means because it depends on how the people themselves interpret their own actions. Okay, that was my rundown on the Communication Accommodation Theory. This theory does not just describe what's happening, it aims to explain why we practice this communication behavior almost 24/7. This theory is incredibly practical because it can be used and applied in a multitude of settings and conversations because we are constantly interacting with people of different groups or cultures. So, I hope you enjoyed this theory competency video and I will see you on Wednesday. Bye, and Rekka.